April 11, 1945. The west bank of the Elbe River. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood still, binoculars pressed to his face, looking east. Smoke drifted across the horizon. Beyond it lay Berlin. 50 miles. No rivers left to cross. No fortified lines. Just open road. Behind him stood the Ninth Army. 300,000 men. Fully supplied. Fully fueled. The most intact American force in Europe. In front of him, German soldiers were surrendering in columns, throwing down rifles, begging to be taken prisoner before the Soviets arrived. The German army in the west was finished. Everyone present knew it. Simpson lowered the binoculars and reached for the field telephone. He did not exaggerate. He did not argue. He stated a fact. His army could be in Berlin within 24 hours. The call went to General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Bradley did not answer immediately. He checked with Supreme Headquarters, with Dwight Eisenhower. Simpson waited, staring at the empty highway that led straight to the German capital. When Bradley came back on the line, his voice was flat, controlled, final. The answer was no. The Ninth Army was to halt at the Elbe. No advance east. No movement toward Berlin. Not 1 mile. Simpson protested once. Briefly, calmly, he repeated the situation. The road was open. Resistance was collapsing. The opportunity would not return. Bradley did not debate him. Those were the orders. Simpson replaced the phone and looked east again. The war's final objective was still visible through the haze. Close enough to reach in a single day. Close enough to end everything. Instead, his army was ordered to stop completely. South of him, George Patton received the same message. The decision had already been made. Not on the riverbank. Not by the men who could see Berlin. But far from the front. In rooms where maps showed threats that did not exist, and fears carried more weight than roads that lay wide open. At that moment, the opportunity was not theoretical. It was measurable, visible, and finite. The American armies in April 1945 were operating at a speed never intended by pre-war doctrine. After the crossing of the Rhine, the German defensive system in the West had collapsed faster than Allied planners believed possible. There was no coherent front line anymore. What remained were fragments of divisions, retreating columns, and local commanders acting without orders. The Ninth Army had advanced more than 200 miles in 3 weeks. It had done so without pausing to consolidate, without waiting for flanks, and without encountering resistance capable of stopping it. This was not because of brilliance alone. It was because the enemy no longer existed in any organized form. Fuel was abundant. Ammunition stocks were full. Supply lines ran unobstructed from the ports of France through the Rhine crossings and forward to the spearheads. Allied air power controlled the skies completely. There were no German reserves to counterattack, no armored formations hidden behind the front, no prepared defensive belts ahead of the Elbe. Berlin itself was not a fortress in April 1945. Its outer defenses had been stripped to reinforce the eastern front. The units inside the city consisted largely of Volkssturm, boys and old men with rifles, and exhausted remnants pulled back from shattered divisions. German officers knew the war was over. Their remaining priority was not victory, but surrendering to the right enemy. Every intelligence report from the front told the same story. German soldiers fled west whenever possible. They surrendered to American patrols willingly. They avoided the Red Army at all costs. The psychological collapse of German resistance in the American sector was total. From a purely military perspective, taking Berlin was not about street fighting or attrition. It was about tempo. The city could be encircled before organized resistance formed. German command and control would collapse the moment American armor appeared on the outskirts. The symbolic weight of the capital would finish what the battlefield already had. The Ninth Army did not need reinforcement. It did not need preparation. It did not need coordination with other Allied forces. The road network between the Elbe and Berlin remained intact. Bridges stood. Rail lines were irrelevant. This was a drive, not a battle. South of Simpson, the Third Army was in an equally strong position. Patton's forces had already crossed into central Germany with similar speed. Together, the American armies had the mass, mobility, and logistical depth to reach Berlin before the Soviets completed their final assault preparations. Nothing in German capability could have prevented it. The opportunity was not only military. It was strategic. Whoever occupied Berlin would control the narrative of victory in Europe. Occupation meant leverage in negotiations, influence over post-war boundaries, and authority over what replaced the Third Reich. This was understood by the men at the front. It was understood by German commanders. It was understood by Stalin. It was also temporary. Every hour of delay narrowed the window. The Red Army was advancing from the east with overwhelming numbers, but at enormous cost. Their momentum depended on continuous pressure. If American forces appeared on Berlin's western approaches, the entire operational picture would change. This was the last moment when speed alone could decide the shape of the post-war world. And it was allowed to pass. The warning did not come from hesitation or fear. It came from experience shaped by logistics, not ideology. At Supreme Headquarters, Dwight Eisenhower was not looking at the road to Berlin. He was looking past it. His concern was not how the war would end, but how it might refuse to end at all. For weeks, intelligence summaries crossing his desk carried the same theme. German resistance was collapsing in the north, but reports from the south told a different story. Signals intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and resistance channels described movements toward Bavaria and Austria. Entire formations appeared to be withdrawing into the mountains. Not retreating, repositioning. The reports converged on a single concept. A last redoubt. A fortified alpine region where the regime could survive defeat in the cities and continue fighting indefinitely. Eisenhower did not invent this idea. German propaganda had seeded it deliberately. Radio broadcasts spoke of a final bastion. Rumors circulated of underground factories, stockpiled food, and protected leadership compounds. Documents appeared suggesting preparations for long-term resistance. The picture being painted was not of desperation, but of design. From Eisenhower's perspective, the scenario was plausible. Germany had used terrain before to offset numerical inferiority. The Alps offered natural fortification, narrow passes, limited access routes, and defensive depth. A small, motivated force could hold out for months, even years, if properly supplied. More importantly, Eisenhower understood what prolonged resistance would mean politically and militarily. The American public expected the war in Europe to end decisively. Casualty tolerance was already strained. Another year of fighting, especially guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain, would bleed momentum from the entire Allied effort. The Supreme Commander also carried responsibility beyond Europe. Japan had not yet been defeated. American planners were already calculating the costs of invasion in the Pacific. Every division lost in a prolonged German campaign would be unavailable for the next war that was already looming. Eisenhower's caution was not rooted in doubt about victory. It was rooted in fear of delay. Berlin, in his assessment, was a symbol. The Alps were a potential reality. A symbolic victory that left a hostile core intact was unacceptable. The priority, as he saw it, was to destroy Germany's capacity to continue fighting anywhere. This logic shaped his preparation. He directed attention southward. He tasked commanders to anticipate resistance in terrain that favored the defender. He reviewed supply forecasts for extended operations. He considered how a decentralized German command might function once the capital fell. From his vantage point, racing for Berlin risked allowing the enemy to choose the terms of surrender. A cornered regime, entrenched in the mountains, could deny closure. It could prolong instability. It could complicate occupation and reconstruction. Eisenhower did not ignore Berlin. He deliberately downgraded it. The decision was framed as prudence. Avoid the trap. Destroy the enemy's last refuge. Prevent the war from mutating into something uglier and longer than planned. What made this warning compelling was that it aligned with Eisenhower's entire command philosophy. He had always favored broad pressure over single thrusts, attrition over spectacle, coalition stability over individual glory. He distrusted operations that depended on speed alone and distrusted even more the idea that wars ended neatly. He believed Germany might still have one final move left. That belief shaped everything that followed. The problem was not that Eisenhower lacked foresight. It was that the foresight he trusted was built on an illusion designed precisely to exploit it. And once that warning was accepted as real, every road leading east became secondary. The overrule did not arrive as a single order. It emerged through pressure, caution, and institutional instinct asserting itself over momentum. By mid-April, Eisenhower was no longer weighing alternatives. He was managing risk inside an alliance already fraying under the strain of victory. Every major decision now carried political consequences that extended beyond the battlefield. The first constraint was coalition management. Berlin lay deep inside the zone assigned to the Soviet Union under agreements already reached. Those agreements were not abstract. They were commitments made at the highest level, designed to preserve unity until Germany was defeated. Eisenhower understood that seizing Berlin ahead of the Red Army would not end the war. It would begin a crisis inside the alliance before the surrender was even signed. Stalin was not a distant partner. He was watching Allied movements hour by hour. Any sudden American thrust toward Berlin would be read as a political act, not a military one. Eisenhower's authority depended on keeping the alliance intact long enough to finish the war. Provoking a confrontation at the moment of victory was not a risk he was prepared to take. The second constraint was institutional memory. Eisenhower had spent the entire war balancing aggressive commanders against broader strategic goals. He had seen what happened when operational ambition ran ahead of political coordination. Market Garden had already demonstrated the cost of betting everything on speed and optimism. That failure still hung over Allied headquarters. Patton embodied that risk. He moved fast. He ignored flanks. He treated logistics as an obstacle rather than a foundation. His instincts were often correct, but they were incompatible with Eisenhower's role as coalition manager. Allowing Patton or Simpson to drive on Berlin would shift control from the command structure to the battlefield. That loss of control mattered more than the city itself. There was also fear of optics. American forces taking Berlin, while Soviet armies were still fighting their way through prepared defenses, would inevitably raise questions. Why were the Americans able to advance so easily? Why had the Soviets paid such a high price? The answers would not be military. They would be political, and they would poison the post-war settlement. Inside SHAF, the Alpine Redoubt reports reinforced every instinct Eisenhower already had. They offered a justification that aligned military caution with political necessity. By framing the Southern advance as a requirement to prevent prolonged resistance, Eisenhower could halt the Eastern Drive without admitting the true balance of considerations. This was not deception. It was institutional logic. The threat in the Alps did not need to be proven. It only needed to be plausible enough to justify restraint elsewhere. Once that logic was accepted, the machinery of command followed automatically. Orders were drafted. Movement priorities were adjusted. Patton's axis was redirected south. Simpson's army was frozen in place. The Elbe was redefined from a crossing point into a boundary. No single officer formally objected beyond initial protests. The chain of command absorbed the decision and executed it. That was its function. Patton protested privately, loudly, and repeatedly. He understood exactly what was being surrendered. He believed the war's end would define the peace, and that Berlin was the key to both. But he had already been sidelined before. His reputation ensured his arguments would be recorded, not accepted. Bradley, caught between his commander and his subordinates, did not escalate the dispute. His loyalty to Eisenhower outweighed his sympathy for the men at the front. He enforced the order. Simpson obeyed without spectacle. He had done his duty by identifying the opportunity. Once denied, his role ended. The overrule was not dramatic. There were no emergency meetings, no shouted arguments, no public explanation. The decision passed quietly through the system, carried by staff officers, and encoded in operational directives. That silence was deliberate. By stopping at the Elbe, Eisenhower ensured that no American commander could create facts on the ground faster than diplomacy could respond. He preserved alliance cohesion. He avoided confrontation with Stalin. He focused Allied effort on eliminating a threat that existed largely on paper. In doing so, he subordinated battlefield logic to institutional stability. The war would still end. Germany would still surrender. The casualty lists would still close. What changed was who would stand in Berlin when the fighting stopped. That outcome was not an accident. It was the product of a system designed to minimize risk at the strategic level, even if it meant accepting irreversible consequences beyond the scope of immediate military calculation. The consequence unfolded immediately, even though the decision itself remained invisible to the men who would pay for it. Along the Elbe, the American advance stopped as if it had struck a wall. Vehicles were parked. Bridges were secured and then ignored. Orders shifted from movement to maintenance. Units that had spent weeks driving east now settled into static positions, facing a city they could see but were forbidden to approach. Across the river, the war did not slow down. It intensified. On April 16th, the Red Army began its final assault on Berlin. It was not designed for speed. It was designed for certainty. Stalin did not need elegance. He needed possession. Millions of men were committed to a single objective, and they advanced with the expectation that casualties were a resource, not a limitation. The artillery barrage alone announced the difference in method. Entire districts were erased before infantry moved. The Soviet command accepted destruction as a necessary precondition for control. Where American planners measured cost against necessity, Soviet planners measured it against time. Berlin became a killing ground because it had to be taken before the Americans reconsidered. Inside the city, German resistance stiffened not because victory was possible, but because surrender to the Red Army carried consequences the defenders understood all too well. Units that would have collapsed instantly at the sight of American armor fought block by block against Soviet troops. Civilians were trapped between inevitability and terror. The American halt ensured there would be no alternative. Every casualty suffered in Berlin after April 11th traced back to the same moment. The moment the Ninth Army stopped. The moment the Third Army turned south. The moment speed ceased to matter. Soviet losses were staggering. Tens of thousands were killed in a matter of days. Entire formations were consumed forcing crossings, clearing streets, taking buildings whose military value was negligible once the German state had already collapsed. But the objective was not military efficiency. It was political finality. When the city fell, it fell to the only army present. While Berlin burned, American forces moved south and east into Bavaria and Austria. The advance was cautious, deliberate, and almost entirely unopposed. Units prepared for fierce resistance encountered surrender instead. German troops laid down their weapons without negotiation. SS formations dissolved rather than defend ground that offered no protection. The Alpine campaign revealed the imbalance between expectation and reality. There were no underground factories, no stockpiles capable of sustaining a prolonged war, no centralized command preparing for guerrilla resistance. What existed were rumors, abandoned positions, and propaganda artifacts left behind by a regime that no longer controlled its own movements. American units advanced through terrain that should have favored defense and found none. Roads were clear. Passes were undefended. Villages were quiet. The feared redoubt did not fight because it did not exist. This realization did not travel back to Berlin in time to matter. By the time American commanders understood the full extent of the deception, Soviet flags were already flying over the Reichstag. The physical symbol of victory belonged exclusively to the Red Army. No American presence existed inside the city to counterbalance that fact. Occupation zones hardened immediately. What had been lines on a map became realities enforced by armies in place. The Elbe, once a temporary obstacle, became a boundary with permanence. The consequences extended beyond Germany. Eastern Europe followed the same logic. Wherever Soviet armies stood at the end of the war, Soviet authority followed. Governments were installed. Borders were adjusted. Political systems were reshaped under the cover of liberation. The Western Allies had no leverage to contest these outcomes on the ground. Their forces were not present where decisions were being enforced. Diplomatic protests carried little weight against facts already established by occupation. For the men of the Ninth Army, the consequence was quieter but no less enduring. They returned home knowing the war had ended without them reaching its center. Veterans would remember standing still while history moved past them. The sense of incompletion lingered long after demobilization. Patton understood the cost immediately. His letters hardened. His language sharpened. He recognized that what had been lost was not just a city, but the balance of the post-war world. He saw the halt not as a pause, but as a transfer of initiative that could never be reversed. Eisenhower saw a different ledger. From his perspective, the war had ended without extending American casualties into uncertain terrain. No drawn-out insurgency followed. No Alpine nightmare materialized. The campaign closed on schedule. The alliance held until surrender. But the price of that stability became apparent almost as soon as the shooting stopped. Germany was divided not by choice, but by inertia. Berlin became a symbol of separation rather than reunification. Eastern Europe entered a different political future than the one publicly promised during the war. These outcomes were not debated in April 1945. They were accepted as fait accompli by the time they were recognized. The decision at the Elbe did not cause the Cold War, but it fixed its geography. Once American forces halted, they surrendered the ability to influence events where influence mattered most, at the point of collapse. After that moment, negotiations could only ratify what occupation had already decided. The consequence of restraint was not peace. It was permanence. The war ended cleanly on paper. It ended unevenly on the ground. The battlefield consequences were brief. The political consequences lasted for decades. All of it traced back to a single decision made far from the front, based on a threat that vanished the moment it was approached, and a caution that outlived the war itself. The post-war record closed the case slowly, through admissions made after urgency had faded and reputations were already secure. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied leaders presented the halt at the Elbe as an inevitability. Public explanations emphasized coordination, agreed occupation zones, and the desire to avoid unnecessary casualties. The Alpine threat was cited sparingly, framed as one concern among many, never as the decisive factor it had been during the war's final weeks. Privately, the tone was different. As intelligence files were reviewed and captured German archives analyzed, the scale of the deception became impossible to ignore. No plans for sustained resistance were found. No evidence supported the existence of underground industrial networks capable of prolonging the war. The documents that had fueled Allied anxiety traced back to propaganda channels, deliberate leaks, and radio traffic designed to be intercepted. German interrogations confirmed what the advancing American units had already discovered on the ground. The so-called National Redoubt had been a psychological operation, a final bluff intended to manipulate Allied caution, not a viable military strategy. Joseph Goebbels had understood his audience. He did not need to convince the battlefield commanders. He needed to convince the staffs, the planners, the men trained to fear uncertainty more than risk. That fear worked exactly once. Patton's correspondence after the war stripped away any remaining ambiguity. In letters and diary entries, he described the Alpine campaign as a wild goose chase. His language hardened when discussing Berlin. He believed the decision to stop had not merely cost prestige, but had reshaped the balance of power in Europe. His warnings were blunt. They were also irrelevant by the time they were written. Eisenhower never publicly acknowledged error. He did not need to. His career advanced uninterrupted. His reputation solidified as the general who won the war without losing control of the alliance. From an institutional perspective, his decisions were defensible. The war had ended on schedule. American casualties had not spiked in its final weeks. No prolonged insurgency followed. In his memoirs, Eisenhower emphasized restraint. He framed Berlin as a political objective whose capture would have complicated Allied unity. He argued that military decisions could not be separated from diplomatic realities. He did not revisit the Alpine intelligence in detail. The implication was clear. Even if the threat had been exaggerated, the caution it inspired had been justified. Other commanders were less forgiving in private recollections. Bradley acknowledged that Berlin had been within reach. He avoided assigning blame, but did not dispute the facts. Simpson expressed quiet regret, noting that history had moved past his halted army while it stood ready to finish the war. German officers, interviewed years later, were openly astonished. Several confirmed that had American forces approached Berlin from the west, organized resistance would have collapsed almost immediately. Their priority had been surrender, not defense. The city's destruction, they noted, had been the result of timing, not necessity. Soviet records, once declassified, revealed how narrowly Stalin had raced the clock. The urgency of the final assault was not driven by German capability, but by Allied restraint. Soviet commanders were ordered to take the city at any cost, precisely because they feared an American reversal. The Elbe halt became a footnote in official histories, but its effects were anything but marginal. The division of Germany hardened into permanence. Occupation lines became borders. Political systems diverged under military protection that could not be undone without confrontation. By the time the Cold War was named, Its outline had already been drawn. The post-war record does not show a single catastrophic error. It shows something more subtle and more damaging. A decision that made sense inside the system that produced it, reinforced by fears that felt rational at the time, and insulated from revision once events overtook it. No inquiry followed. No corrective action was possible. The men responsible moved on to managing the world that resulted. The case closed itself, not because the decision was right, but because history does not reopen outcomes once armies stop moving. The final verdict is not ambiguous. The decision to halt at the Elbe was not forced by German resistance. It was not dictated by logistics. It was not required by battlefield reality. It was the product of institutional caution, alliance management, and a fear deliberately manufactured by an enemy that no longer possessed the means to fight. Dwight Eisenhower chose stability over initiative. He chose coalition harmony over operational advantage. He chose to trust intelligence that confirmed his instincts rather than commanders who could see the situation directly. That choice ended the war cleanly. It also fixed the post-war order before diplomacy ever began. Berlin was not taken because it was unnecessary to win the war. It was not taken because taking it would have disrupted agreements already made. And it was not taken because the cost was deemed unacceptable. It was not taken because the system governing Allied command could not tolerate the risk of acting faster than politics. The result was permanent. The Red Army paid the price in blood. The eastern half of Europe paid it in decades. The Western Allies paid it and lost leverage that could never be recovered. The Alpine redoubt never existed, but the consequences of believing in it did. Once the American armies stopped, history moved without them. Occupation hardened into division. Temporary lines became borders. What might have been negotiated from strength was instead accepted as reality. This was not a failure of courage at the front. It was a decision made far from it, by men whose responsibility was not to win battles, but to manage outcomes. By that standard, the decision succeeded. By any other, it closed the case on Europe's future before the war itself had fully ended. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped victory and defined the peace that followed, subscribe to the channel and leave your thoughts below. This case is closed.